544 DeBriel Street.
The water is steady rising in the attic, ma'am. And I'm going to drown in the attic.
And
I'm 37 years old.
Hurricane Katrina was the costliest natural disaster as well as one of the 5 deadliest hurricanes in the history of the United States. Katrina is ranked as the 3rd most intense American cyclone. Overall, more than 1,800 people died and the total amount of property damage almost reached $110 billion. Katrina started out over the Bahamas on August 23, 2005. The next day, it became a tropical cyclone headed for West Florida. Katrina transformed into a hurricane only 2 hours before striking land on Hallandale Beach in Aventura on August 25th. The cyclone spun itself into the Gulf of Mexico on August 26th and quickly strengthened into a Category 5 hurricane. Fortunately, Katrina weakened into a Category 3 hurricane on August 29th as it made its way into southern Louisiana. More than 50 breaches in the New Orleans Hurricane Surge Protection are the cause of most of the deaths and destruction. Eventually, 80% of the city became flooded and the water lingered for 4 weeks.
As the storm neared the shoreline, thousands of people evacuated the city of New Orleans. But unfortunately, over 25,000 residents were forced to stay due to lack of transportation out of the region.
So I was living in Baton Rouge at the time. And it was just me. I was working as a teacher there, and Baton Rouge itself didn't have any of the flooding issues that New Orleans had, but we had a lot of the consequences that came from the flooding in New Orleans and the fact that displacement of people. Overnight, Baton Rouge went from a town of 250,000 people to 500,000. And literally in 24 hours. Things that changed immediately that were quite visible to everybody was traffic. I mean, what would normally take 20 minutes to do was taking 2 hours. The Baton Rouge airport, which currently only flies to 4 cities as of today, was flying basically internationally.
Cities, like the one that Mr. Huves was living in, drastically increased in population. Some cities had a tough time accommodating new people, but local residents were very generous and allowed the new people to feel safe in environments.
That probably the most impacted my life was the fact that in teaching, I went from having classes of 27, 28 kids to 40 and 50 kids. And then within those classes of 40, 50 kids, these were kids who they just lost their homes and they didn't know where they're going to be tomorrow. For about 3 weeks to a month, I literally would have kids coming in, and then 3 days later they're gone, and somebody else comes in, and it was rough. For them and for everybody.
Even the President of the United States at that time, George W. Bush, urged people to leave the city, but people who could not afford to flee had to stay. The mayor of New Orleans, Ray Nagin, did the best he could to get the residents out by ordering the first ever mandatory evacuation of the city. He aided in the efforts to get people out of the area by changing interstates to have them be one-way traffic that went away from the city. He also made it possible for people to use the Superdome as an area of last resort for people without shelter during the storm. Some residents took advantage of this and did not leave just to stay in the Superdome, which led to a jam-packed stadium. In addition, the infrastructure put in place to stop hurricanes, such as levees and canals, were not up to par with the ferocious nature of Hurricane Katrina. The levees were only able to withstand storm surges and winds that a Category 3 storm brought, and Hurricane Katrina was a Category 5 storm. Also, the public transportation systems, including buses and trains, were shut down before the storm hit, which made it difficult for doctors and caretakers to get to their patients. A lot of civilian lives were saved by the fact that approximately 900,000 residents left the city before the storm made landfall.
the world didn't really know how bad it was for a couple of days, really.
When it came to the city of New Orleans, it wasn't the storm damage that was the problem. It was the flooding that came afterwards. That didn't really start happening until after the hurricane had moved through. The levees couldn't be repaired in time, and the city started to flood. Instead of streets, you saw canals. It made it really, really difficult to get assistance in those first few days.
I remember after the storm passed, I had power in my apartment, and I finally got cable, and we were looking at the helicopters that were flying over the city, and just words can't even imagine. You would see something like that on TV, like in South America or in Africa, but like to see in the United States just buildings destroyed and water where there should not be any, and people on rooftops and everything that happened, it was something that no one was prepared for.
The city of New Orleans is at a disadvantage. The average elevation is 6 feet below sea level. That means that the city is surrounded by water. This did not help when the levees broke and allowed water from the Gulf of Mexico to enter. As water entered the city limits, it spread quickly as there was nothing in the way, and it just flowed downward through streets, homes, and businesses. The hurricane also brought 8 to 10 inches of rain, along with winds up to 175 miles per hour. The people of New Orleans were displaced as houses flooded and bridges were destroyed. In the Superdome, there were barely any law enforcement officers, which left people with the ability to get away with pretty much anything they could think of.
Also, picking the Superdome as a place of the shelter of quote-unquote last resort without fortifying it with protection, that is something that, number one, they will never do that again. The Superdome will never be a shelter of last resort. There will be no shelter of last resort, but I believe the plans are to just get everybody who wants to go out. But having people in the Superdome without any kind of security or any kind of protection would be something that they should have changed.
There was just no hope in sight for the people of New Orleans.
After the first day of the storm, 80% of New Orleans was underwater. This forced those that remained in the city to scramble for higher ground and caused many to cling to their lives as they waited out the storm in their attics or on rooftop. This first day of the storm was by far the worst, as citizens were facing horrible conditions and death due to drowning, starving, murder, and other factors. However, despite these conditions, the government was still painfully slow to react and initiate even simple relief efforts.
First of all, when it first happened, like that first day, there was really no rescue. You at the time there was a rule that New Orleans police officers had to live inside the city. So whoever was in the city, they were just automatically on duty. But within a couple of within 2 or 3 days, you had people who were abandoning their posts because people were fighting back, shooting guns. I mean, it became a war zone for all intents and purposes. Then people tried to go in and start delivering aid, but people would shoot at the helicopters or shoot at the rescue vehicles. So that was also preventing the rescue. So for a good while, like a couple of days, there really wasn't much of a rescue effort. It was basically you were on your own. And a lot of people died just waiting for the rescue aspect.
Governmental relief efforts such as the Federal Emergency Management Agency or the National Guard took days to even make a presence in the increasingly desperate city. Even when governmental aid programs were finally put in place, they still lacked a concrete plan. Governmental officials seemed to be completely unaware of just how bad things were because of the storm.
Within that time period, the federal government and other agencies were also blocking private groups, churches, religious organizations, nonprofits from going into the city. And what happened was, frankly, people just went around the laws, and they actually received help from some law enforcement in Louisiana, because there were certain legal red tape stuff that was there that the federal government said no, you can't go in there, and people were like, okay, fine. They just went and did something else to get back into the city, and some of the sheriff's office helped them do that.
The government simply failed at the most fundamental level. Every little bit of governmental intervention fell through in a matter of days as it became increasingly evident that the country was definitely not prepared to face such a large-scale disaster. plans for an established food and water supply to the refugees collapsed. Secure shelters became places of increased crime and poor sanitation. The initial problem was magnified by the lack of an immediate and adequate response.
Extensive flooding throughout New Orleans was caused by the high power waves constantly bashing against the levees. The National Guard was called in to help with the evacuations. Many people evacuated and moved to a different, safer place like Mr. Hubez was living in. According to the NOAA, it was the largest displacement of population since the Great Depression. According to the Data Center, which is an independent research organization, the storm displaced more than 1 million people in the Gulf Coast region. In addition to the houses destroyed, neighborhoods flooded, and lives ruined, there's also a political storm which followed Katrina. The rescue and recovery efforts following Katrina became highly politicized, with federal, state, and local officials pointing fingers at one another. Critics blamed an aging and neglected federal levee system and a slow state and local response following the disaster for the high loss of life and damage. Many people ignored the initial warnings, which caused massive strain for rescue operations. Michael D. Brown, the director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, was forced to resign, as was the New Orleans Police Department Superintendent Eddie Compass. Louisiana Governor Kathleen Blanco and New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin became under critical examination for not ordering evacuations sooner. Blanco ended up not running for re-election in 2007, and Nagin ended up leaving office in 2010. And also in 2014, Nagin was convicted for money laundering before and after Katrina, and is currently serving a 10-year sentence. In the end, government officials in the House of Representatives who were investigating the response and aftermath found in all failures in all levels of authority. The committee's final report was titled "A Failure of Initiative."
Hurricane Katrina left a substantial impact across the country and affected many different people. Years after the storm took place, the ramifications of this horrible event can still be seen. The various devastating effects of the storm dramatically changed life in the New Orleans area, and some of these changes can still be seen today. The city's population of 1.38 million people before Katrina in 2005 dropped down to 1.04 million in 2006 and has still not returned to pre-hurricane levels even 10 years after the storm. Despite the awful effects of Hurricane Katrina, the country has learned its lesson. In the years following the storm, substantial efforts were made by both the city of New Orleans and the federal government to correct the issues that led to the devastating conditions of the storm. One of the most immediate changes was that the city upgraded its levee system to improve structural integrity and be able to withstand Category 5 hurricanes. Also, in recognition of the abysmal relief efforts, Congress passed various acts that reorganized the Federal Emergency Management Agency to improve its response to large-scale natural disasters. However, perhaps the most significant change is that the city, state, and federal governments have all improved their responses to disasters like Katrina by improving their warning systems and by trying to maximize evacuation efforts to get the most people to safety. Katrina was a horrible disaster, but from it we have learned how to deal with catastrophes of the highest caliber.